SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28. Chapter 34. Lovely Declarations. Draco had never in his life considered himself to be a physically affectionate person. In fact, quite the opposite. His father's most extreme displays was a firm clap on the shoulder, and his mother typically expressed herself through a gentle touch on his arm or a caress of his face, although since the war she was definitely prone to more maternal actions like hugs and even kisses on his cheek. Being raised in pure-blood society, where rigid formalities were far more common than familiar gestures, had caused him to view anything beyond a handshake or offering one's elbow to be superfluous and annoying. He had staunchly held to those beliefs until he'd hit puberty. More precisely, until the first time he and Pansy snuck into a broom closet on their way back to the dungeons. Obviously, snogging someone meant you had to touch them, and he had discovered that he didn't mind it too awfully in those circumstances. Though, admittedly, most of the touching he and Pansy did was fumbling and awkward, neither one of them really knowing quite what to do with the other's hands, and he found he didn't enjoy her grabbing his face or mussing his hair. What he truly despised, though, was her abhorrent attempts to keep touching him after they'd left the confines of said closet. Apparently, in her mind, kissing him meant that she had the right to drape herself all over him whenever she pleased. As any hormone-driven young wizard would have done, Draco had tolerated her attentions just long enough to keep her happy so that she wouldn't turn him down when another opportunity in a dimly lit corner presented itself. He'd flinch and grimace the second he'd felt her snake her arm through his, or grind his teeth when she played with his hair, and normally after counting to 10 he'd extract himself from her clutches. He absolutely refused to allow her to sit on his lap, however, and the only time he'd ever played along with her groping nonsense for a prolonged period of time was on the train at the start of 6th year, mostly to put on a show for Potter, who he had known was hiding in the luggage rack. No, he was not a touchy-feely person, although living with so many Gryffindors had significantly heightened his tolerance for such gestures. It seemed like high-fives, fist bumps, shoulder punches, and arms slung around necks were an additional language to the Scarlet and Gold clan, with hugs thrown in there for good measure every so often. And that was just the blokes. Girls from all 3 of the other houses were far more physically interactive with those of his former lair. They played with each other's hair, laid their heads in one another's laps, even held hands or linked arms as they walked down the corridor. It displayed a closeness that he'd never experienced before, and took quite a while for him to get used to, if he was honest. When it came to actual couples who were dating relationships, Draco used to sneer at and mock any overtly displays of affection. Regardless of the fact that he now considered Weasley somewhat of a friend, memories of him slobbering all over the brown girl during 6th year still made him gag. Holding hands always seemed childish and clingy, and a bloke who constantly walked around with his arm flung around his girlfriend's shoulders seemed to be sending out some Neanderthalithic message to any other male who might approach his woman. He couldn't understand the need to constantly be touching someone, nor could he conjure up any desire to experience it. He enjoyed his personal space and was content to keep at least a few inches between himself and his fellow magical beings, or at least he always had been, until recently. Since the Valentine's Day party, he had noticed an alarming upswing in his desire for physical contact, particularly with one specific witch. It wasn't even about snogging her, which was extremely enjoyable whenever they found themselves in a private moment, but it was the non-snogging content that was driving him barmy. When she wasn't in the room, he was fine, but as soon as she entered his line of sight, it was as if every fiber of his being strained to be close to her as possible. He had lost count of the number of times he'd snatched his hand away as it had crept closer to her, seemingly of its own accord. It wasn't like he was trying to grope her or anything, nothing indecent by any means. Simply seeing her hand on top of the desk made him want to hold it. Watching a curl fall from her face gave him an urge to twirl it around his finger. Sitting next to her on the couch set off an impulse to pull her in close and tuck her into his side. Each and every one of these inclinations made him feel like he was going slightly mad, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could control himself before he gave in and became one of those suffocating idiots he used to loathe. It was due to this ridiculous notion of propriety and respectable distances, and not wanting to be a grabby oaf, and the fact that he simply didn't do things like that he was currently, literally, sitting on his hands on the couch in front of the fire in the room, next to his favorite brunette, while she studiously perused the textbook in her lap. Her legs were crossed under her, and she was wrapping one of her wayward curls around and around her finger as she read, and Draco was absolutely itching to touch her. He wanted to play with her delicate fingers and interlace them with his own. He wanted to run his thumb down the smooth column of the nape of her neck. He wanted to tug her hair out of the wonky bun on top of her head so that he could bury his fingers in her curls. He wanted to scoop her up into his lap and snog her breathless. Wanted to wrap his arms around her and never let go. His elitist upbringing and detached demeanor had gone all out the window the first time Hermione kissed him, apparently, because now, being close to her seemed the only thought taking up residence in his previously impressive brain. He was just trying to think of a way to tear her attention away from her homework when she closed the book with a satisfied thud and set it on the floor. "Done," she announced with a smile as she stretched a little this way and that, after being in one spot for so long. Instead of making a move to go anywhere, however, Hermione turned slightly towards him and rested her cheek on his shoulder, leaning her knees over in his direction and stifling a yawn. Before he could even consider his reaction, he had wrapped his arm around her, tugging her a little closer, and placed his other hand on top of one of her knees. She responded by placing one of her hands on top of his and began tracing random patterns on the back of it. He knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that if his sixth-year self had walked in on a scene like this, he would have scoffed at the poor, ridiculous sod and wondered where he'd left his manhood, and yet he couldn't care less. Right here, in this moment, he was completely content, and he didn't care how sappy or clingy or vomit-inducing anyone else might think it to be. He was happy, genuinely happy, and it had everything to do with the petite witch curled up at his side. Seeing as there currently wasn't anyone around to witness his total abandonment of ingrained decorum, he pressed his lips to the side of her head and inhaled the sweet scent of her shampoo. "You're quiet," she observed, tilting her head to study his face. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," he nodded, smiling down at her. "Everything is perfect." He bent his head and kissed her on the tip of her nose, causing her to giggle. "I think I'm finally caught up on everything. The party took up more of my time than I'd anticipated, but I think I'm back on schedule now." She started to lean forward and glance at her color-coded study chart on the floor next to her textbook, but he gently grabbed her shoulders and pulled her back, wrapping his arms securely around her so she couldn't get away. "Draco," she giggled again, "what are you doing?" "Homework time is over," he mumbled into her shoulder, reveling in the feel of her in his arms. Hermione huffed in mock indignation. "If I fail my defense test later this week," but he cut her off before she could finish what she surely would have been some warning or mild threat. "Like you would fail anything. Ever." She started to protest, but he silenced her with the finger pressed to her lips and shifted so his face was right in front of hers. "You'll have plenty of time to study again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. You've been at it all evening, and now it's time to focus your attention on something else." The whole time he'd been talking, her eyes had drifted back and forth between his eyes and his lips, and when he removed his finger, freeing her to speak again, she shifted a little closer. "And what would that something else be?" she whispered. Without answering, he simply leaned forward and kissed her, and was once again filled with a sense of rightness and completion and all the warm, fuzzy feelings he swore he'd never succumb to. And the only thought in his brain was that he wanted repeated moments like this for the rest of his life. He wanted her for the rest of his life. That thought froze him on the spot. It was like a bolt of lightning had struck him, and he fought to keep his hands from shaking as he drew back from their kiss. Her eyes were just fluttering open when he stood abruptly, muttering something about needing to use the restroom, and walked as fast as he could towards the boys' bath without looking like he was running from a stampeding hippogriff. Once inside the mercifully empty space, he began pacing the length of the tiled room, trying to force his thoughts into some semblance of order. For the rest of his life? Had he seriously thought that? Yes, he had. Did he mean it? He pondered that for a few seconds. He tried to envision his life after Hogwarts. He knew he would get a job, even if he didn't have the slightest clue what that job might be at the moment. He knew he eventually wanted a house of his own. As much as he loved his mother, he had no desire to live in the manor permanently. He also knew that someday he'd like to have children, or at least one child, as was his family's tradition. As he considered these possibilities, the person by his side was always the same beautiful curly-haired, brown-eyed witch that was sitting on the couch, probably wondering if he'd gone round the bend, the way he'd fled from her side. This was not the first time he had thought like this, but it still hit him like a bludger out of nowhere, mostly because each subsequent time his errant daydream snuck up on him, it only solidified his resolve for it to become a reality, and that very notion terrified the stuffing out of him. I'm 18, for Salazar's sake. He scrubbed his face with his hands as if to wipe away the far too vivid images in his mind, or the longing they stirred in his soul. The rational side of his brain had no desire to get married straight out of school, and wanted to have something, a substantial something, to offer his witch before he ever broached the subject with her. He needed to have a steady income and a place to live, for starters. He had no intention of simply living off his family's estate. Roaming the halls of his abode day in and day out would drive him mad. Even though his pragmatic nature stood firm on these points, the other side of his apparently besotted and useless brain only whinged at the prospect of not being able to be with her every day. Merlin, he was a mess. A complete and utterly ridiculous mess, and he felt like if he didn't do something to solidify at least a tiny bit of a promise of a future with her, he'd go barmy before he made it to breakfast tomorrow morning. Refusing to argue with himself any longer, he marched out of the loo and straight back to the couch, where Hermione was still sitting, nibbling nervously on her lower lip and watching anxiously for him to return. A flash of relief crossed her face, before her brows furrowed in concern at the serious look on his face and the determined posture that carried him across the room. Her eyes didn't leave his face as he sat back down in the spot he'd vacated, turning to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his own, watching as their fingers wove into one another's. "Hermione," he began, only to immediately stop when he heard her inhale sharply. He glanced up to see her eyes widen with a questioning look. While he was more comfortable using her given name as of late, he tended to reserve it for important moments, a habit she was clearly aware of. He smiled then, softening his features, which seemed to set her at ease once the worry faded from her expression, leaving it open and affectionate. Staring into the eyes he adored, he felt his heart begin thudding in his chest, and his mouth went drier than a desert. But by Godric, he was going to get this out. He started again. "Hermione, I know we've only been together a short while, but there's something I need to tell you, and I really hope it doesn't send you running for the hills." He watched her intently, but her expression didn't change. She simply gave a small nod, inviting him to continue. "I know I've told you how much I appreciate you, and enjoy spending time with you. I hope you know, too, how deeply I value your friendship, and that you believe me when I tell you the things I admire about you. But I need you to know that it's more than that this is more than just a dating relationship, at least for me." Her gaze turned slightly more thoughtful, as if trying to gauge where he was going with this. By now, his heart was positively trying to climb up into his throat, and his hands were embarrassingly clammy, but he didn't care. "I realize we're still rather young, and we've no idea what's going to happen once we leave this place, but I have every intention of pursuing you outside the castle walls. You have become such a huge part of my life, the very best part, and I can't imagine it without you. I don't want to imagine it without you." He saw her eyes start to swim with tears, and had to force a swallow around a lump in his throat. "I like you, Hermione Granger, a whole lot, but more than I can even begin to explain. In fact, to be entirely honest, Merlin, this sounds insane, but I am pretty sure I love you." Her eyes flew wide at that, and he forged ahead. So that's that. I love you, and I needed you to know." He took a huge breath, feeling like he'd run a marathon, and also feeling rather sheepish about his uncharacteristically sappy bout of word vomit, but all his insecurities vanished a second later when she crashed her lips into his, her hands holding on to either side of his face, the force of her action causing him to thump backwards against the arm of the couch. It was all he could do to wrap his arms around her as she showered his face and neck with kisses for several heartbeats, feeling rather amused by her exuberance, and extremely pleased that his profession had been so well received. When she righted herself, she wiped the tears that had fallen on her cheeks with the cuff of her sleeve and sat back to look at him. Her eyes were still glassy, and her nose was a tiny bit pink, but he thought she was perfect all the same. She huffed a deep breath and gazed at him with obvious, blissful elation. "Do you really?" she asked quietly, her brown orbs pinning him with a steady yet wondering stare. He nodded, a small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He ran his knuckles gently down the side of her face and took her hand again. "That's good, then," she continued, "because I'm pretty sure I love you, too." If Draco had thought his heart was full before, it was ready to burst now. He had hoped she would return his affections, but had no idea how much it would actually mean to hear her say it. And now that she had, he felt his own eyes start to sting. Refusing to sink further into his feelings than he already had, he simply gathered her up in his arms and pulled her against him in an embrace. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, blinking furiously to clear his vision, and trying to take steadying breaths to calm his racing heart. She loved him. When he felt like he could speak without choking, he gently teased. "So, we're pretty sure about this?" Hermione chuckled. "Yes, almost positive. But, I've never really been in love before, so I didn't want to just assume that's what was going on here." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Will you settle for 98% sure?" "Where's the other 2%?" he grumbled. "Margin of error, room for improvement, that sort of thing, She shrugged, a teasing glint in her eyes. "Well, as long as I get to pick what area to improve upon." He didn't finish his statement, and instead claimed her lips once more, deciding that this would be a good place to start.